Hello, so I am Christine from Log Life Handmade, and today I'm going to be taking you through how to make one slipper from start to finish with my new pattern. So my pattern is Sheepskin Slippers by Log Life Handmade. You can find it on Ravelry, and the sizing is from newborn to men's size 12. So it's actually broken down into 3 different patterns that can be bundled together. So we have newborn in 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months to youth size 3, and the adult sizes are ladies 6 to men's 12. Throughout the pattern, there's also some YouTube videos that are going to be a lot shorter than this one. So you can have a quick access through the pattern to all the different stitches and a few different tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So to get started, you're going to print your pattern, or you can follow along on your phone. But if you are doing the templates, then you're going to need to print at least part of the pattern. So what you'll find here on page 2 is the necessary supplies. So we have our wool, our sheepskin. We'll need a single hole punch, which I don't have pictured here. That's just a step that you can do on your own. The leather punch, a pen or a marker, large scissors, crochet hooks. So you're gonna have a 3.5 millimeter hook and a 6 millimeter hook. Now the 3.5 millimeter hook is not as important for gauge as the 6 millimeter hook is. So if you have something similar to a 3.5 millimeter, then that's going to work just fine. You'll need a little bit of cotton macrame cord. That's sort of optional. I do like to add the cords, but definitely the cord stops are optional. You can add them or not. You can just do ties. So this is the important page for printing. So page 4, you're going to find all the different sizes and your sizing chart in US sizes, and your crochet pattern page and your soles pattern page. So you may want to print the crochet pattern page, or you may want to just follow along on your device while you're crocheting, but the soles pattern is what you're going to get to make your template for the sole. So that's going to look something like this. The soles pattern page, you'll print these off, cut them out, and then you use your paper hole punch to punch out all the little dots, and that's what we're going to use to trace onto our sheepskin. So we'll start with that step. So you're going to take your pattern piece, your template from your sole, and you're going to, I like to actually have it in cardstock form. This is just printer paper. I actually have a version that's actually made out of cardstock. I find it a lot easier when you're tracing onto your sheepskin to use the cardstock, because then you're less likely to sort of slip with your marker as you're tracing. So you'll have that, cut out the holes, and you just fit it onto your sheepskin sort of wherever you find fits best. You may have a larger piece. This is sort of a sheepskin I've been using for a while. I've made lots of pairs of slippers out of this. So I just find kind of a spot to put it. So we'll do that today. Take your marker and you trace around. And then you just do a little dot inside all of your little holes. There we are. And we cut that out. So I'm using a real sheepskin. I buy them from a livestock supply, which is close to my home. They're Canadian medical grade sheepskin, and I find they work really great. The leather part on them is nice and thick. It's also really soft and buttery. The fleece on it is cut to a 1 inch, trimmed to 1 inch, which I find kind of nice, because then I don't have to trim it down at all for my adult sizes. For these little sizes, you'll see I do trim it down a little bit. But you can also use, another thing I like to use as well is recycled sheepskin. So you can get old coats from a thrift store. Sometimes you'll find on Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji, people are selling sheepskins. That's great too. Repurpose it if you can. I've also cut up a pair of old Ugg boots that a friend had given me. They made great soles. So get a little bit creative, repurpose some stuff for these soles. You can also use faux sheepskin. So if you find a faux sheepskin coat, as long as the sort of flat part, the leathery part it won't be leather, it'll be faux, so polyester. As long as it's thick enough, it should work, especially for these kid sizes because they don't wear them that long, right? So I like to just trim down on these little sizes. This is a 3 to 6 months. So I'm gonna trim down just so that the little feet have a little bit more space inside the slipper. And then you can see it is still nice and fluffy, but it's not quite as thick. You can save these little cut off bits. If you're making a lot, you can save it in a bag. It makes great stuffing. It's an all natural stuffing. There we go. And there we are. So there's our sole. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to punch it out with our leather punch. So the leather punch you can buy at Michael's. You can buy it at leather supply stores. You can also buy them at some sewing stores. In the pattern, there's a link to my local sewing shop. I really like to support local when I can. For things like this, the price isn't much far off from what you're gonna pay at Michael's anyway. Punch out all the holes. You want to try to get all the little marker pieces. You want to be close to the edge, but not too close to the edge, because you may find that it rips a little bit when you're attaching your yarn onto the slipper if you get too close to the edge. You also don't want to be too far in, because you may see little folds of the leather popping up between your stitches. It's a slightly messy process, so what I typically do is I'll make a whole bunch of sizes of the soles at once, kind of make a big mess out of my table, clean it all up, and then just have them saved in bags for slippers as I go. There we go. So now we have our sole all cut out like that. We'll just take a second to talk about our yarn a little bit. So I'm using Catch a Love Wool. It's a bulky yarn. It's wool and alpaca, so it's all natural fibers, which I really like to use for the slippers because you get the breathability, the antibacterial properties, things like that. So you don't really have to wash them quite as often. They don't get really stinky, things like that. You can also use blended yarns, polyester or acrylic. That's fine. It'll still make a really nice slipper. Also, often those are plied. This is a single ply, so it's a little bit tougher to work with. It kind of does rip. You just have to be a little bit careful, and you will see some felting and some pilling with the real wools. So we're gonna start with our smaller of the hooks. So this is a 3.5 millimeter hook that I'm using. Again, the gauge on this hook isn't important. What you want is to make sure that this hook is going to get through your holes comfortably like this. So you're going to start on the fleece side, poke through to the leather side, and then you're going to take your yarn, loop it around your hook, and pull it through to create a loop onto the fleece side. Then you're going to wrap your yarn on your hook again and pull through. It's just a little chain one there. Okay, we're going to move to the left counterclockwise. So you go into the next hole, wrap your yarn again, pull through to create a loop. So now you have 2 loops on your sole, and then you're going to wrap and pull through both. So that's going to create a single crochet stitch. Now you're going to work around the entire sole doing that single crochet stitch. What's going to happen here is you're actually moving counterclockwise to the left around the sole, and you're actually going to end up working your slipper with the wrong side of the crochet stitches facing the outside of the slipper. So your right side of the crochet will be on the inside of the slipper. This gives it a bit of a different shape. I've done it before with the right side of the stitches on the exterior of the slipper. It looks a little bit cleaner, but the shape of the slipper changes a bit. So you're actually going to get sort of a different shaped slipper. Now, if you get through a pair and you notice that you have done the right side facing out and you've gone the other way around, it's not a big deal. Just as long as your slippers fit and you like them, then that's fine too. So you don't want to have too much tension in this row. You want to pull that loop up and make sure you have a little bit of slack in your line, so that you, if you do this row too tight, you're going to get a lot of curling around your sole. There's sort of a little bit of fleece that comes up once in a while. You just sort of brush it away, tuck it in behind your stitches. You'll see on one of the next rows, sometimes the fleece, the wool, will poke through the stitches onto the outside of the slipper. I just take the back of my crochet hook and poke it back in. So working your way around. You can also use some other materials for your soles. It doesn't have to be sheepskin or faux sheepskin. I've used natural rubber before. It's called crepe. You can buy it at certain leatherworking stores. You can also use leather, or you could use possibly like a yoga mat. I've never tried that, but in theory it should work as long as you don't rip your holes. Okay, so when we get back to the beginning, what we're actually going to do is we're going to go back into that first hole. So we go from the fleece side back into the first hole and do that last single crochet stitch on between the last hole and the first hole. And then to join, you're going to go into the first stitch here, the little V. This is sort of a tough part. You just kind of push through there, and then you're going to slip stitch that one and chain one. Okay, so that's the beginning, the first row. You're gonna have it sort of look like that. On the back, you'll have your tail poking out. We'll tuck that in a couple rows. So then you'll see, sometimes, especially when you're first getting started, just take a quick check. I've definitely skipped holes before, and you have to pull it all out and start over. That's not very much fun. Okay, so we're gonna switch to our 6mm hook. There is a gauge test, so if you want to check your gauge and you're using a different hook, that's fine. I've always been able to get the gauge proper with my 6mm hook. So this row is going to be a row of half double crochets, and we're going to actually start in this, not this stitch right there, but this stitch here. So we'll start there, you wrap the yarn, create your double crochet or your half double crochet stitch, and we're just going to work that all the way around. Sorry, I'm using a yarn bowl, which I really enjoy because I find I can fit my ball in it, and my ball doesn't roll around when I'm tugging because you go through quite a bit of yarn. But I am pulling from the outside of the ball, and it's sort of giving me a little bit of grief while I'm stitching a little bit more awkwardly today. One thing I do love about the Catch a Love wool is it comes ready to go. So for something like the Cascade Magnum, Malabrigo Rasta, you're going to have it come in a hank or skein, and you will need to wind up your ball in order to use it, or you'll have to have it sort of stretched out or laid out in a way that you can pull from it. You can use a swift and a winder in that instance, but not everybody has those. It's another couple tools that you have to get, which kind of just adds into your startup cost. Unless you already have them, then by all means, the Cascade Magnum and the Malabrigo Rasta are excellent options for the slippers. So we've worked almost all the way around in that half double crochet stitch. And actually I should have taken a moment to talk about row 2. So the first row is for all sizes will be attaching. The second row, the pattern's written a little bit differently. So for some of the sizes we do a single crochet row, and for some we skip right to this half double crochet row. The reason is that if you add that single crochet row as row 2, you're going to get a different fitting slipper. So your slipper is going to, it just adds just enough bulk in the beginning that you get a wider set slipper, or like you kind of just build enough more body. So if you have kids with a chubbier foot or a thicker foot, it may be maybe an option you want to do is to add that single crochet row. It's not written in from size 3 to 6 months up to 18 to 24 months, but I do have it written in from the 2 to 3 year to the U3 and in all the adult sizes. But like I said, it is very much an optional row. If you know that you're making slippers for a more narrow foot, then you may want to just skip that altogether. Okay, so at this point I like to take a second to just weave in that end while I have my easy access to the bottom of the slipper here. So you're going to pull the tail in from the other side onto this side and then weave it into the half double crochet stitches here. I use my small hook. It's quick, easy to get into the stitches. And you just get that little tail woven in, and then you don't have to reach down to the bottom of your slipper at the end. Another thing you can do at this point is sometimes I'll just turn my sole inside out and I'll sort of just pick along because I have something to pull against there and pick off that excess fluff. Just from the cutting, trimming, and punching process, you end up with a little bit. There we are. So now we'll start the next row with single crochets. This is going to be our first decrease row. So when we get to the double crochet decreases, we just want to be a little bit mindful of our tension when we're doing those. So when you wrap your yarn over to start the double crochet decrease, the tension in that yarn is fairly important. You want to keep your hook low. You want to keep the tension in this strand there in that wrap over to keep the stitch you're making as close as possible to the stitch before. So you want to keep the tension fairly high here. And then you've made that the first half of a double crochet. You're going to do the same thing in the next stitch, finish a half a double crochet stitch, wrap over and pull through all 3. Now here's where a little trick that makes a pretty big difference is you pull this just to tug it down, get that tension a little bit tighter. If you don't, sorry, I have a mosquito. If you don't do that, you're going to get, if you don't keep a bit of tension in the double crochet decreases, you could get some gaps in your double crochet decreases, and you'll see that in your slipper. So again, you make your double crochet decrease, it's double crochet 2 together, you finish off and you give it a little tug. So wrap, keep the tension high, particularly in the first half of the stitch. The second half of the stitch is not as important. Then you finish off and give it a little tug. Again, finish off and just a quick tug. Okay, so that's our double crochet decrease section. With the higher tension, you're just going to keep those little stitches quite close together there. Create a nice solid little booty. Otherwise, your tension, you want it to be slightly higher than if you're making something like a blanket, but you don't want your tension to be too high either, or you're going to get you'll get your slipper to curl up a little bit, and you don't really want that. You want it to kind of be able to stand on its own. So in the single crochet section, we just kind of use, I would say, average to higher tension. You're using a larger hook than what the yarn typically would use, so you are going to get a fairly dense material. Okay, so then when we get back, we're going to go into the first stitch of that row, do a quick slip stitch and chain 1. Our next row, again, a double crochet decrease row. We start with our single crochets. We move on to our double crochet decrease again, keeping those nice and tight together, little tug as we finish each stitch. Your first slipper, you may find you have a couple little things. It's a bit of a learning process. You have to keep in mind I've made about 900 pairs of these slippers, so I go quick. I have some muscle memory. I know my stitches inside and out. I can pretty much make these in my sleep. So if you're looking at this and thinking, oh no, I can't do that quite as gracefully, you'll get there. It takes time, takes patience. There we go. And the great thing about crocheting, especially with bulky, if you make a mistake, you find you have to frog and head back, tug it all out, it's not that big of a deal. You haven't really wasted too much time per slipper. When we finish up that row, we're going to do a slip stitch again and a chain one, and we're going to go right back into that stitch. We have one more decrease row on this size. This last decrease row is what you're going to use if you want to alter the ankle size. So again, if you have you have a kid or an adult that has a thicker ankle, you may want to have less decreases in this last row. There's a note in the pattern on how to do some alterations, and that's one of them. If you ever have any questions about the numbers and you're just not able to figure out how to decrease your number of decreases, you can always send me a message. I'm happy to work the numbers for you to get the booty size that you want. You can also increase the number of decreases in that row to make a much smaller ankle size, but probably wouldn't recommend that. I kind of err on the side of a smaller ankle size for most of my booties. There we go, just keeps them fitted on well. So after that last decrease row, we're going to chain two. We're going to switch to double crochets here. This is going to end up being your cord row, the first double crochet row. It has increases, so our increases is just you're going to do 2 double crochets into the same stitch. So I already did one in that stitch, just going to do a second double crochet into that stitch and continue working around. Okay, so I have one more increase in this row. It'll be this stitch here. So I do my first double crochet stitch and then my second right into the same stitch. When we get to the end of the row, we're going to slip stitch again into the top of, so it's sort of like you've chained 2. It's kind of that the loop there between the chain and the first stitch. Slip stitch that over, chain 2 again. This row is straight double crochets all around. Hopefully my autofocus isn't changing too much. You can see what's going on. The tension certainly in the ankle part doesn't need to be as high, so if you are sort of a lower tension crocheter, you can sort of let your guard down a bit here and get a little bit of looser tension. So we've almost gotten around. Back to the beginning, and we're going to slip stitch again chain 1 this time. And then our last little row, just a quick single crochet row just to polish off the top. Sometimes this happens with the single ply. I sort of tore at the yarn a bit. When that happens, I pull back, start that stitch over again. So we've gotten around with this single crochet, the last row, we're gonna slip stitch, and then I do a sort of a chain 1, but leave that loop. That's where we'll cut the loop. There. So set that down, and then with that loop, we just pull the end through, and we're gonna weave in this end. I sort of follow the same weaving path all the time. It doesn't really matter where you go, but I like to go into the top single crochet and then the center of that single crochet stitch on the inside. And then I sort of follow along down the seam line. So I want to go into the double crochet and then into the connecting chain there. And then I'll go back into another double crochet here and then into the slip stitches along the back. Try to cut my tail about 3 inches. That gets it down the whole back of the slipper on the inside. And this will felt in, so don't worry too much about doing a super duper weave job. There we go. There's our slipper. Little 3 to 6 month size. At this point I like to use my larger hook to thread through my cord. In the pattern it'll give you an ideal number of stitches to leave at the front. So we have 6 on this size. We want to count 2, 4, 6 stitches. So that's where my cord is going to enter and exit. So we just go with your large hook, weave through to the back of the ankle, grab your cord and wiggle it through. Then you count 2, 4, 6 again and weave through. This is the quickest way I find to do these. You can just take your cord and simply weave it through. All right, so then we have that at the front. I'm adding cord stops. I just put 1 cord stop per slipper onto both cords. Sometimes I have to tighten it up to get these knots done. Do a little knot at the end. You can also knot the 2 together, but I find with the thicker cord, it makes a bit of a large knot. A bit cumbersome, especially for these little ones. And there we go. We have a whole slipper completed. Now, another thing I find useful with my yarn bowl is I'm kind of sometimes making these on the go. I have kids, I have to drop what I'm doing, go do something else. I like to keep a little pair of scissors and my 2 hooks. I drop them into my yarn bowl with my yarn and my slipper and my cord stop and cord if I have that already cut and ready to go. And then I just have this as my sort of little working station that is sort of on the go. One other thing about the pattern that I'd like to just talk quickly about is I do have a page per pattern, per size. It's actually two patterns per page. And then I also have a quick reference sheet at the end of the pattern, which is going to give you all the sizes per pattern in one large chart. So probably not for your first slipper would you be able to use that, but as you get used to making slippers, if you're going to do lots of pairs, it's a great guide to have handy to keep in your project bag. All right, so once again, I am Christine from Log Life Handmade. My pattern is available on Ravelry, in my Ravelry store, and I also have a Facebook community. If you'd like to join it, I'll add the link in the description. Just a place for chatter about all the slippers you've made. You can post photos, you can ask questions, you can get inspiration and ideas, maybe some yarn suggestions, things like that, just to sort of join in on the fun. Thank you for watching.